Hello, today we're going to install the U.S. Water System Synergy water softener. The Synergy comes in three different sizes: 3/4, 1 inch, and 1.5 inches. The 3/4 is the 9100 Fleck valve, and it has a plastic valve body and plastic crossovers. A 9000 is the 1 inch Fleck valve, and it's going to be brassed. Now, the 1.5 inch valve is called a 9500, and it is brass as well. The 3/4 valve will come with a stainless steel bypass that you can get in 3/4 inch or 1 inch. Ours are all going to be 1 inch. And it uses what's called a 3/4 inch turbine meter. That allows that valve to stay truly 3/4 inch throughout. Now, the 1 inch valve, you can order it with that same 3/4 meter and bypass valve, or you can order it with just straight pipes, and then you can use your own 3 valve bypass. Now, ours, we're going to use the 3/4 turbine valve as well as the stainless steel bypass, or the 3/4 turbine meter as well as the stainless steel bypass. So once you get everything, you're going to want to pull everything apart and lay it out and make sure you have everything you need. Okay, one of the first things that you're going to take out will be your tanks. Once you have your tanks out, you should have a center distributor tube in the tank, and there should be a perforated basket on the bottom. Now, these can vary depending on which tanks we're using at the time or which actual distributors we're using. They're all pretty much the same, but you make sure that you have that on the end of your distributor, and then your distributor will actually center in your tank and drop right in the center of it. So once it's dropped into that indentation, you should have basically flush across the top. There shouldn't be any kind of protrusion of the distributor tube. Now, again, we're going to lay everything out, so you should have a control valve and a cover, a set of crossover tubes, a funnel to fill the tanks, secondary tank adapter, the instruction manual, your boxes of resin, a brine tank, and obviously your 2 mineral tanks or resin tanks. The first thing we're going to do is fill the tanks with resin. Again, we're going to check and make sure the distributor tube is in there, and we're going to make sure it's centered in the indentation in the bottom of the tank. Like I said, when it's centered, you'll notice that it's exactly flush with the top of the tank. Now, when we fill the tank with resin, we don't want to get anything in this center distributor tube. So what we do is we take a small piece of duct tape and we actually cover that hole during the filling procedure. Once that's covered, then you can install your funnel. Now, depending on what size system you have, depends on how your resin will be packaged. We have 1 cubic foot boxes as well as half cubic foot boxes. So obviously, if you have a 1.5 cube unit, each tank will have a 1.5 cubes. Now, they may actually send 3 full cubic feet. If that's the case, then you'll just separate that last cubic foot between the 2 tanks. But it just depends on how it's packaged at the time. If we have half cubes pre-made, a lot of times we'll ship it that way just so there's no confusion when you get ready to pour that in. Now, we don't send extra resin, so you're going to use all the resin you have. Like I said, if you have full cubic foot bags, then we're intending for you to split one of those bags between the tanks. If you have 3 cubic foot tanks, then obviously you'll have 6 full bags and you'll put 3 in each. But you're going to open these up and fill them, and you kind of want to shake this as you go. Sometimes a helper is good to have, and it's not a bad idea to have a face shield or maybe some goggles on and maybe even a mask over your nose and mouth. These beads are not toxic, but if you get them in your eye, they're hard to get out, and especially if you get it in a tear duct or something. So it's a good idea to have a set of safety glasses or something on at the time. Dust from the resin should be minimal at best. If you want to hold a shop vac in the area just to kind of pull the dust air away as you pour the resin in, you can, but usually dust from resin is very minimal. That's usually from other media such as carbon and things like that. Now, the full bags, when you open up the full box, that'll be in the actual bag of the manufacturer. But when you get half bags, we bag these ourselves, so this will be a clear plastic bag in here with no writing on it. That's just the way we package them. We take them out of the original packaging and we separate them into 2 clear plastic bags to make 2 half cubic foots, basically, so, or feet. So once we get the resin in, we're going to, like I said, distribute evenly between both tanks and fill the tanks. Once the tanks are full, then we can remove the funnel and then remove the duct tape, and make sure you get all the duct tape off. If you have some real old duct tape that the glue is really, really tacky, you may consider getting some new ones, or some new tape, because you don't want to leave a bunch of tacky residue on this distributor tube, because this is what's going to facilitate the seal of the O-ring when we put the secondary tank adapter or the main control valve on there. So once we've filled both tanks, then we can basically start the installation. Once we have the tanks full, we're going to want to put them in place. The location of the softener is critical. We want to make sure that we're capturing all the water in the plumbing system that we want to soften, first and foremost, but also we have to make sure that we have a 110 outlet available to power up the valve, as well as a drain that can accept the flow rate from the particular size system that you have. When I say flow rate, I'm talking about the backwash flow rate. On a softener, that's going to be dramatically less than what your service flow rate is. Let's say a 3 cubic foot unit, that may only be 5 to 6 gallons per minute of backwash flow rate, but it's critical to make sure you have the proper drainage. Any kind of backup or anything on the drain line can actually cause problems within the valve. So the first thing we want to do is, once we have these full, and obviously make sure you remove your duct tape, we want to put the actual control valves or the secondary tank adapter on. So to do that, on a 9100 valve, and here I'll just show you, this is the 9000 valve, the brass valve, as well as the 9500. On these valves, we don't have what's called an upper basket. These valves will just mount directly to the tanks. On the 9100, and you'll see it in the manual, there's actually a cone-shaped upper basket that pops in there. But really, those are on the 9100 because it's more of a DIY type system, and we want to make sure that someone doesn't put water to the system so quick that they blow the resin out of the drain. That's why they're there. Normal operation, they do nothing. So usually when we go with a 9000 valve or a 9500 valve, it's usually more of a commercial application, and we're dealing with, you know, professional plumbers and things like that. So that's why we don't facilitate that actual upper basket on these brass valves. So anyway, once we have the valve that we're going to install, we want to make sure that the outer O-ring as well as the inner distributor O-ring is lubed. Now, what we have here is U.S. water, it's food grade silicone grease. You can get that from our website, but you can also get it locally too. But I always just make sure there's a little bit of grease on these O-rings that'll really help facilitate a good seal as well as an easy installation. So you can see the hole on the bottom here is for the distributor tube that's in the center of the tank, and then we thread it in, and this outer O-ring seals on this upper nylon surface. So we want to line that up on that center tube, and you'll see it kind of fall down on there on the O-ring. Now, the transformer is going to be here with the valve, so you kind of got to hold it as you start to spin it in. Now, when you install this valve, if it doesn't spin in easily, then you probably have it cross-threaded. So sometimes you got to back off and start again, but I mean literally you should be able to take one finger and spin it in like this, because if you can't, then you have it cross-threaded and you need to take it back out because you're going to have a problem later. So once it's there, I usually take palm of my hand and the other hand and just kind of give it a couple wraps to make sure it's nice and tight. The O-ring does the work as far as the seal, so it's not like you have to take and crank this thing on there. The O-ring is going to seal it. And really, I discourage anybody from using tools to tighten this down because it could really break the valve if you're not careful. So hand tight, and then just a little bit of snug with the palm of the hand. You can even give it a little tap if you want. Now, once the control valve is on, we're just going to move this one over a little bit. We'll bring the other tank into place, and these are a little heavy because we have resin in them. Now we're going to put on the secondary tank adapter. And you can see it looks a lot similar in the bottom. There's the center O-ring for the distributor and the outer O-ring for the sealing of the tank. Again, we're going to put a little bit of grease on here. And then we're going to line that distributor up on this center hole. Push it down on there. And then again, be really, really careful to not cross thread these. Now, something that some people may not realize, but if you go backwards first, a lot of times you can feel the actual head click down into the threads. When you feel that, then there's a pretty good chance it's not cross-threaded and it'll spin right in like this one did. Now, there's a set of tubes that will connect these two together, okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install this in the plumbing and get this secured, because we know once this tank is fixed, then we can basically hook this tank to it after the fact, and we can kind of get around a little easier and work and everything. So we're going to install this first with all the plumbing and the drain line and everything, and then we'll put this secondary tank in place when that's done. So for now, we're going to move this tank to the side. We're going to get this into position and start some plumbing. When we install the in and out plumbing, we're going to install it to the 1-inch bypass valve. And you can see on the bypass valve that there's arrows which point flow direction. The arrow pointing towards the unit would be the inlet, and the arrow pointing out or away from the unit would be the outlet. So keep that in mind when you're installing your plumbing. Today we're going to use these Flex connectors to do the installation. These are 1-inch female, and they actually seal with this rubber seal in here, and then they have quick connect fittings on the other end. So to do that, we have to put a short nipple in here to be able to attach this to, because this is female thread. So that's the first thing we're going to do. And I've already pre-taped these with Teflon tape, but make sure you get a healthy layer of Teflon tape on there. You want to make sure you don't get a leak here, because it's always a pain in the neck to have to go back and fix it later. So as you can see, I've only Teflon taped one side, because again, that rubber O-ring in the flex hose is going to seal on this end. So we're going to install this first, and I recommend that you use 2 pairs of channel locks so you're not putting all your stress on the whole valve when you tighten this down. I usually get one that's holding the bypass valve, and then one on the actual fitting that you're installing. But that takes the stress off the bypass valve, and it's less likely to damage it. Do the same thing with the outlet. Now first we're going to do the inlet, and again, look at your bypass and see which arrow is pointing towards the unit. That's your inlet. So we're going to install it first. And these I usually just snug hand tight. If we need to snug them later, if they drip, we'll do it then, but you don't want to over tighten those and smash that O-ring really bad. And now we'll go ahead and hook up the outlet plumbing. Now once both of these are attached, you can go ahead and put the valve in the bypass position. There's a pointer on here that will point to either the word bypass or service, but when the handle's bisecting the plumbing, that's the bypass position. When it's in line with the plumbing, that's the service position. But we're going to leave it in bypass for now. What I like to do is, at this point, once I've made my connections here, I go ahead and put water through the bypass and check and just make sure I don't have any leaks, but I also flush out any kind of plumbing materials that may be in there if I happen to use solder or glue or something like that. So once this is done, again, you're going to go to a close tap and open up the water, and then you're going to slowly feed water through the bypass. Make sure this is in bypass, because if it's in service, you're going to shoot water out these hoses here. So make sure it's in bypass, and then flush everything out, and then check for leaks up to this point. If you don't have any leaks to that point, then we can go ahead and start installing the ancillary tank. When you get your valve, these clips may or may not be on the valve. If they are, we're going to need to remove these so we can put the crossover tube in. Now, on this side, there's a little access hole you can see here that you can get through this to this inner clamp or clip, and it's tough to get to. I already know but it can be done. It's done every day, but it's tough to get to for sure. Now, I like to take out these intermediate sleeves, and the reason why is if they're in there already, I mean, you can assume that they lubed them, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I put some grease on these, because I don't want to leak here after I get done. I want to make sure that I've covered all the angles. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease on each one of these and pop them back in place. Once we have those in place, make sure it seats down in there all the way, and then we'll do the same thing with the ancillary tank. Again, remove the clips if they're not already removed, and then I'm going to take these out and go ahead and grease these up. Reinstall these. Make sure they're all the way in there. And then now we can get the crossover tubes and get those in place. This particular crossover tube is for much larger tanks than we're using today. So you can see there's quite a bit of space between the two tanks. Now these should fit together pretty easy. You don't want this to be into any kind of bind. It should sit together and everything should sit pretty friendly. If it doesn't, the tank bases can be leveled to help facilitate that, but make sure these things are fitting together really good. You want this to be somewhat level too, so if your floor's uneven, again, prop one tank up or whatever. If you get a real bad angle or bind in here, you're going to get a leak. So you want these to be pretty true and straight when we install them. A lot of times you just keep going back and forth till you make sure everything's nice and straight across. And then we can go ahead and start putting our clips back in. You can see the clip will go in the slot as well as over the crossover tube, and that's what holds it tight up against the valve there. But these little screws are really tough to deal with. They're hard to hold on to, but that's just the nature of the system. These outer three aren't too bad. It's that inner one that can really be a bear. So we're going to go ahead and do it now. Get it out of the way. Well, if you have silicone grease, you can use my trick here. Put a dab of silicone grease on there, and a lot of times that'll help hold that screw onto the actual nut driver. That way you can get it in there a little easier. Once you get it in there, just snug it down tight, but you don't have to crank on it. These aren't providing the seal. These are just holding the components together. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side. And these screws should spin right in. If they don't, then you probably have them cross-threaded, so make sure they're spinning in freely. And sometimes you may have to knock it together the last little bit to get the last clip on. Now again, these tubes are for much larger tanks, but you would always want to make sure you have a minimum of 1 inch of clearance between these two tanks. We want to allow for some deflection as well as some flexing. So usually these are going to be pre-done for you, and you don't have to worry about that. But sometimes on the 9500s you have to actually install your own crossovers and solder them in. And if that's the case, make sure you always maintain at least a 1 inch distance between the two tanks. Now, once we have the ancillary tank attached to the system, we can go ahead and hook up the drain as well as the brine tank and brining system. When you get your system, these fittings may already be installed, but you can see that there's no Teflon tape on there. A lot of times they're just installed that way so they don't get lost. If they are taped already, they may be okay, but I still recommend getting in here and checking them regardless. So I'm going to take these off. I can see there's no Teflon on here, and I'm going to apply some Teflon. Okay, once you have them Tefloned, you're going to put your reducing bushing in first. Again, make sure it doesn't cross thread, make sure it spins in there easily. Be careful with your tool not to break the fitting or the plastic backing on the valve. Once that's secure, then spin in your barbed fitting. Secure it the rest of the way and face it towards wherever your drain line is going to come out. Then once that's done, then you can use your drain line. We use a 5/8 OD, half-inch ID tube. I have to cut this one to fit. So once we cut to fit, we're going to get a hose clamp, put over our tubing, and we're going to push our tubing on there, and we're going to tighten our hose clamp down. Now, depending on the system, this drain could be larger. Larger systems may have, larger drains, so it may facilitate a different type of drain system. The rule of thumb is to maintain the same size drain line as whatever your fitting is coming off of your system. That way you always ensure that you won't have any kind of back pressure on it. Get a screwdriver and we'll tighten this down. Now you want to make sure the drain line's tight because the system's going to drain with force. So there's going to be pressure here, especially if it's a long run or you're going vertical. So make sure this is tight or you'll get a drip here. You may even get a false positive on a tank leak or something like that just because this thing's dripping. So make sure you get that nice and tight. Once the drain line's in, now the next thing to do is install the brine tank and brine line. When you get your brine tank, the brine line will be coiled up in the bottom and it will have some brass inserts on each side of that brine line. So I'm going to retrieve that line and we're going to go ahead and attach it to the valve while we're at this camera angle. Again, as you see, there's brass inserts in the end of this brine tank. On the side of the valve, there's a brass nut that you can spin off, and be careful because the actual sleeve that seals is underneath it. It's a white plastic sleeve. So once you get that out of there, we can drop the sleeve out and you can see. Now, the nut will go on first. Then the plastic sleeve goes on with the taper facing the valve. Once that's on there, you're going to push the tube in as far as it goes until it stops. Slide the nut down and start spinning it down on there. This is another opportunity for a cross thread, so make sure this is straight because you don't want this to cross thread. It'll leak for sure, and if you have a leak here, you're not going to be able to make soft water. So I tighten it down as far as I can with my fingers, and then I snug it up a little bit more with channel locks or a small adjustable wrench if you have it. Will work good for that too. But don't be afraid to crank this down tight. Obviously don't break anything doing it, but You want this thing snug, because if this is loose, this is what's going to cause a no soft water problem. So once that's done, then we can hook the other end to the brine tank. So we're going to switch camera angles now and do that.